Mental health and how we approach it is a discussion that's held around the world, but we very often forget to include the correctional system and how we treat our inmates when we're addressing their medical and their mental needs. In the Journal of Offender Rehabilitation, there's an article from Dr. Weaver detailing his firsthand account while incarcerated. He received very little medical treatment in regards to his mental health, and himself and others that also suffered from mental illness detailed that they almost gave up in the system. They no longer expected any treatment in their mental illness while incarcerated. This is a clear indication that something is wrong with how we treat our inmates in jails and prisons. Dr. Smith, a professor here at USC, wrote in the International Journal of Offender Therapy and Comparative Criminology that there's a documented lack of resources and education available to prepare, assess, and handle circumstances of self-injurious behavior in correctional facilities. Self-injurious behavior occurs when mentally ill offenders become manic because of lack of treatment, and they feel that they're in a situation that they cannot get out of. Corrections already is a debilitating system where you feel you are incarcerated, you feel trapped, and you feel like you have no one to talk to. When you encompass that with depression, manic behavior, and other compounding mental illnesses, it's very easy to take the next step into self-injurious behavior and ultimately suicidal behavior. This is very prevalent within our criminal justice system because of our lack of treatment. The correction system is run at a state level. It is a Department of Corrections at every single state, and there is no federal funding other than federal penitentiaries. These federal penitentiaries show a greater level of mental health treatment, and so they're left out of this particular discussion because at the state level, there's little to no funding allocated toward our correctional system in terms of our mental health treatment. We must enact change and advocate for criminals because they are not taken seriously at a political level. We have to reach out to not only state officials at the Department of Corrections, but also Congress and House of Representatives at our state level in order to get policy change to allocate funding in law. Increased funding towards mental health facilities and also training of a minimum 40 hours in the mental health field for all correctional officers starts the conversation towards building a better mental health faculty within the correctional system. It also should be noted that beyond medicine, there are no therapeutic services available for criminals. We have to allocate a system of therapy that's beyond the medicine aspect and more of a professional setting where they get to have discussions about what they're feeling in order to treat the issue and not just mask it with medicine. Criminologist Dr. Soderstrom stipulated in the Journal of Offender Rehabilitation that there's an increased risk of mental illness within the prison system that turns manic because of that lack of treatment. When we continue to mask with medicine and refuse to treat with therapy, we continue this cycle of manic behavior, which ultimately results in a segregation. This segregation is found by Dr. O'Keefe in the Journal of Offender Rehabilitation to be implemented at a significantly higher level towards mentally ill offenders. They're often segregated and isolated from their peers that aren't mentally ill in order to mask the issue and not have to deal with it. Within this segregation is often solitary confinement for an extended period of time, potentially up to a month, where they are just locked in, given food, have zero interaction with even correctional officers. They're just given their food while locked in a dark box. This only will increase the manic behavior, which will again result in segregation and end up in a cynical cycle. We have to do something to change this because when they're in these boxes, it results in the increased manic behavior that I previously discussed and can lead to self-injurious behavior and ultimately suicide. Our rates of suicide are significantly higher in our prison system among mentally ill than in the general population because of the lack of facilities. Even our free clinics offer better mental health treatment than our correctional facilities. Ultimately, the issue starts within at-risk children. When juveniles display criminal behavior, there's often an underlying either familial issue or mental health issue. We refuse to treat these, and we treat them as criminals. We just rehabilitate them by giving them community service or sending them to a class. We very rarely incarcerate, but we still do not treat the underlying issues, and it turns into a cyclical behavior. There are very few programs allocated to assess the needs of juvenile offenders, and one of which is the Helping Alliance. Excuse me, Matthews and Hubbard, two criminologists that work within the Journal of Offender Rehabilitation, studied the Helping Alliance and what has worked and what hasn't, and found that two key factors distinguish Helping Alliance and help reduce recidivism among juvenile offenders that have mental illness traits. There's a minimum of 100 hours of treatment. Those 100 hours can include medicinal treatment, therapeutic treatment, and often set in group settings and talking about what issues they have at home that have compounded with their mental illness. There's also a treatment within their own environment. While in the correctional facility we can't do this, the segregation removes them from their environment that they call home within their cell, and it creates a lack of stability in their lives, and they're no longer able to understand their behavior. When treating at the child level, it decreases the rate of mental illness within the prison setting, because if we started out young, then obviously it'll compound later on in life. Within adults, Dr. Meyer, another criminologist of the Journal of Offender Rehabilitation, said it so many times, found that selective matching between offenders and mental health professionals also proved very beneficial. Rather than just sticking a correctional officer with mental health training and assigning them to a group of people, you have to allocate resources and select mental health professionals that are willing to see past the criminality in the offenders and work with them one-on-one. Generally, a mental health professional within the correctional system shouldn't handle more than 10 offenders, and those offenders should be alike in demographic, crime, and sentencing, so that they're not giving out different advice to different people within the correctional field, because they will talk in the correctional field. While it's hard to separate the criminality from the illness as a general population, it is our job to advocate for all people, especially when it comes to humane treatment within systems. We have plenty of laws in SLU for mental health treatment. However, they're not allocating funding in order to appease these laws. They're there and they're not worked upon. So we have to go to our officials and increase the funding. We have to demand training for all correctional officers. A minimum of 40 hours was found to be beneficial in Minnesota, but it should never stop the training. And we have to advocate for therapeutic services. Simple medicine does not work at the correctional level. Mental illness needs to be treated at all levels, including the correctional system. That's what I got, y'all. Let's discuss it.
So what do you think this, what kind of impact would this have, like prison population, like overpopulation, especially from like, the juvenile level, like, would it impact like less, maybe mentally ill kids going to jail, like in the future? Is that like a good general idea? Like,
yeah, so within juveniles, around 40% suffer from mental illness. It's often undiagnosed, and simple learning disabilities are considered mental illness when it comes to criminality, because learning disabilities lead to criminality. Well, there's a correlation, not a causation, so let me correct myself there. But so starting there, you reduce that 40% when you start treatment, and so it reduces to about 10% that continue that criminal behavior. Within the adult population, around 70% are diagnosed with mental illness, and 80% of those 70 have compounding, so they have multiple mental illnesses. And when in Minnesota, they see a lot of treatment there. That's one of the best states for mental health treatment within the correctional field. And they see a reduction of recidivism by 70% within those inmates that have compounding, and around 50 that have just one. And so I know these stats from like my classes that I've taken, because this is what I study. So I don't have like the exact citation for it, but those are just the stats that I can pull out my head because I spent 4 years studying this. So
yeah, so like I guess when I hear like prison, like I feel like the connotation in the world today is that like those people should be suffering,
Mm-hmm.
Like they did something wrong, that's why they're in prison. So I feel like that's something like this cause is going to come into like conflict with when like trying to be implemented, is that like some people just don't feel like prisoners should deserve, you know, very well treatment. Like people in our society today can't even afford mental health like programs for themselves, much less for like people who have like now killed people, you know?
Yeah, and so the treatments vary a lot within the behavior that they just like show, but ultimately the goal of the correctional system isn't to punish, but to like repair. And I don't want to say rehabilitate because that is a very like mental health term, but you're supposed to fix the problem, punish them for what they did, but they're not supposed to spend their lives there unless they commit a heinous crime such as murder or rape. But for like drug possession or for burglary, robbery, crimes like that, like you're doing the time for it, you're removed from society, you're in a prison cell, like you literally have a toilet in your like next to your bed. And so the idea that we can treat their medical issues but not their mental issues is kind of where that comes into play, because they still are humans, and they still deserve mental health treatment, because ultimately it's just, if you don't treat that, then they're going to do time for manic behavior because their time's going to get extended. And then that's where the issue comes into play, that their time is getting extended for a behavior that they can't help because they're not being treated for it.
Yeah.
There's definitely an incentive there for us as a society to provide those services too. It seems like it's, you know, you want to punish them obviously, but like you can't have people that come out. I forget what, I was watching some video on like people being recommitted, and it's just like, it's incredible how many people get out and then like have nobody and nothing. And they just like, there's like, I mean, it's like, what would you do if you like got out of prison, had mental issues and like nobody to go to and no job? And it's like, you know, it's hard to believe that anybody makes it out, you know, as a normal citizen with like some of the conditions that these people are released into. It's a real shame.
Yeah, and there's two key factors on reducing that recidivism rate. They obviously have to want to have mental health treatment. If you don't want it, then it's never going to work. But extending that mental health treatment after release, because there is a probation period after all releases. And so if you extend it into that probationary period, then that's when you find the highest success in reducing recidivism rates. Because if we just put them out into the world and say, all right, go to the free clinic, then they're not getting the same exact person that they've been having, and it just really messes with their psyche, and they continue that criminality mindset.
Sure.
Do you think like coming into prison, just every single prisoner should be evaluated, or just once they show signs of mental health issues?
I think you can already not evaluate people that have a documented history, because then you know that they have the issues. You don't have to do that processing. But upon intake, it's pretty easy just to sit down for a 30-minute to an hour conversation upon intake. You'd be surprised at how few people actually get processed into prison systems. Jails are just holding for court. And then if you can't post bond, then you sit in jail. But for a prison system, your intake is maybe 20 people a day. So you have 5 people. That's 4 hours of assessing mental health. And then I think that's a pretty short day. And ultimately, if they don't show signs, they're not going to show signs. But assessing them prior to intake, then that shows that you're going to start addressing the issues as soon as they show, rather than, and you're going to be preemptive, you're going to be prepared for it to show, rather than being reactive and viewing it as manic behavior because they're incarcerated rather than because they're mentally ill. But I think that was like 5 minutes discussion, so